Welcome, everyone, to Mother's Day at the Bay Area Book Festival, and these two writers certainly write about mothers, among many things. I'm Sherilyn Parsons. I am the festival founder and director. Thank you. To the entire team. It takes a lot of people to put these together. So I also want to welcome our live stream audience. We have a lot of people watching, which is fantastic. And I want to encourage you to purchase the book here, and the authors will sign their books right in the lobby after the event, sold by Green Apple Books. So please support our local independent bookstores coming to the festival. The usual, you know the drill: silence your cell phones, keep your masks on, and note your nearest exit toward the back. You all know that, sort of you festival regulars, that we often have Booker Prize winners in our lineup. And this year we have a very special moderator joining us. Gaby Wood is on the screen. I can't see her right here. She is the literary director of the Booker Prizes, and she was the head of books at the Telegraph in London for many years, and at the Observer for a long time before that. She herself is an author. She's judged many prizes, and we are just very delighted to have her join us to discuss the new books of these two Booker winners, finalists. So thank you, Gaby. Thank you, Douglas and Nadifa. Have a wonderful program.
Could I grab a copy of my book? Your book?
Oh, okay. I'm gonna bring them copies of their books. Hold on.
Just nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, hello, both of you. It's nice to see you via screen, via San Francisco somehow, you know.
Hi, Gaby.
Hi, Gaby.
Nadifa, do you have a copy of it? Will you read from your book a little
Yes.
bit? Or, okay, good.
I've been disorganized, so I just need a copy of my own book to read from.
Very good. As long as it hasn't been given away to someone, we can wait for that. But so those of you who are virtual and actually present, I just want to introduce these two a little bit. I'm sure you know a bit about them, but and I've had the pleasure of knowing them for a while, or having met them, in wonderful circumstances. Nadifa is the author of 3 books. The first was Black Mamba Boy, which won many awards, and so did her second, Orchard of Lost Souls. Her third, which you're about to hear from, The Fortune Men, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year. And she was also selected as one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists in 2013. I don't know if you're familiar with those lists, but they're done once a decade and have a very good track record of selecting future classics. And I had the pleasure of being part of that selection then. So certainly we go back a long way in terms of my admiration for Nadifa. And Douglas, as you'll know, was the 2020 Booker Prize winner for his first book, Shuggie Bain. Luckily, he'd already written his second, otherwise it would have been probably quite hard to keep going. Shuggie Bain became an instant and much-loved bestseller, as I'm sure you know. He'd also written some really wonderful, sort of crystalline and incredibly sort of taut and evocative short stories in The New Yorker by then. So Douglas, I hope more of those are coming too. But his new book, is Young Mungo, and has been, rapturously reviewed, and quite rightly so far. One thing I will say is that these two writers were, of course, not shortlisted for the Booker in the same year. And I know this is not all about the Booker, but one thing that happens when people are shortlisted is that the books start to speak to each other, even though they are kind of, well, I was going to say they're randomly selected. They're absolutely not randomly selected. They're selected on the basis of their virtues. But the fact that they happen to be on the same list is, incidental to their own existence. But they do start to bring things out in each other. And that's what I'm thinking now about this incredible pairing of you two, because your books do show something, or quite a lot, about, well, we'll talk first, I think, a little bit about hidden Britain. But whatever the main topics of your respective books, I think there's plenty that overlaps within them. And I'm really looking forward to the two of you sharing your experiences of writing them and having them read. So thank you, and welcome, everyone. Do you, we might actually talk a little bit about that before you read. Is that all right?
Yes.
Because I think, when I say hidden Britain, I mean two things, I suppose. One is that these characters don't necessarily routinely appear or haven't routinely appeared in the pages of fiction. And the other is that they're sort of unseen in their own worlds, the worlds that you describe. Although in the case of Nadifa's main character, he's also seen where he isn't. So there's a miscarriage of justice based on that. But I think Shuggie and Mungo are sort of, they're both invisible and also too many eyes on them, right? Do you want to say a little bit about the close up and the broader picture of Britain and these characters, if you can?
Yeah.
Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can start. It's good to see you, Gaby. Thank you for doing this from so far away, and thank you for everyone for coming today. But yeah, much of my impulse to write this story was because I felt there was so much silence around these experiences, these queer working class experiences in the United Kingdom. So much of our queer history anyway for the past couple of centuries was entirely erased, or it wasn't recorded. And that becomes even sharper when you come from a place of poverty or you come from a place of the working classes. And Shuggie and Mungo for me were just these voices in very masculine places. I was always thinking about the patriarchy, but thinking about how macho the community was. And even for heterosexual men, how narrow the expression and the self-expression was allowed to be. And part of the reason why Shuggie Bain as a novel came to be was because I'd always actually known the strength of these industrial communities to be women or to be the mothers within it. And yet we never really got to share those voices. I'm the son of a single mother. And not only was my mother this real font of strength, but she was also processing the world in a very different way, because all of the things that were happening at the time seemed to be happening to men. But when men were struggling, it was the women and children that were suffering. And those were the stories that we never heard from. But I grew up, when I came of age, devouring queer fiction. And I felt often within Britain that the queer lives were captured from a place of privilege. There was an awful lot of boarding schools, there was some private men's clubs, there was the ability to go into sexual exile and go to a large liberal city. And the consequences for young queer people living in poverty are just entirely different. The story, the narrative, the world that you get to see is so different. And even, I don't know how you feel about this, Nadifa, but my characters are also, the world is hidden from them. Not only are they hidden within the world, but they just don't see much of the city that they live in. And that's socioeconomic, it's also psychological. They don't get to see the well-heeled part of Glasgow. And within all of that are just these lives that felt very urgent to me.
Yes, that's really familiar, and it's strange when I read Young Mungo how familiar that world is to me. I've not been to Glasgow, but those pockets of deprivation, of alcohol addiction, of various things were around me as well. And it's very rare to see characters like that in fiction. With Mahmoud Matan, who was the real man that inspired this novel, he was in the archives, so I guess there was a visibility there that his story was captured in the archives. But the real person was lost. The words that were left there, the interviews, the presentation of who he was controlled by the state, by the police, by the prosecution service, by the prisons. So you are looking for someone who has been officially hidden within the archive. And I was trying to pursue what could have been the real 25-year-old who was executed for this murder that he didn't commit in Cardiff in 1952. But there's also the trap. I guess masculinity is another thing that traps and hides people. And as I was trying to get to grips with who he could have been, it made me think that all of the times where maybe his hubris or his volatility, all of these things that he had become used to expressing, they were part of the reason why he was able to be found guilty of a crime he didn't commit. And rather than falling back and admitting his vulnerability or his fear even, he kept saying he didn't care. They can do what they like. He's not afraid of them. And that was a really poignant thing that I found about him, was that if he had just been a different kind of man or had been able to live a different kind of masculinity as a black working class sailor, he may have had a better chance of survival.
But he had a sense of pride and of self-worth, right? That was worth something to him. And Agnes Bain and Shuggie Bain has that same feeling of she is worth something, even when people think that she's not worth very much. And the problem is it is her downfall as well. It becomes her Achilles heel. And that notion of hidden Britain is also intersects with the solidarity that working class communities feel. There's a lot of support, there's a lot of solidarity there if you conform, if you fit in, if you belong squarely at the center of that.
Yes.
But if you're a woman like Agnes, who is perhaps not, by definition, a great Catholic mother, she's a single mother. She's a woman that's, big and imperious, and she's a little bit too technicolor for the grey streets. And so much of it comes from her pride, in the same as Mahmoud's does. And pride can be a really dangerous thing to have,
really
and people want to.
For vulnerable people.
That's right. They want to pick at it, and they want to be like, "Who do you think you are to have that kind of self-worth?"
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's really true. And I think that Mahmoud also didn't fit squarely into the paradigm, where he'd alienated the Muslim community by his petty crimes. He'd moved away from the Somali community, which would have protected him. He didn't fit in anywhere, and that's why the police were able to pinpoint him as their victim.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I mean, who sets the parameters of what belonging means in each case, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a great scene I remember from Shuggie where Shuggie, they're moving into this new house, and the way you get to see how sort of performative he is, or at least, I suppose how much he doesn't exactly assimilate in that particular group, is that the new neighbors say, "Ooh, look at Liberace." Liberace's just moved with this tiny child,
Yeah.
And you think, okay, now as the reader, you think, okay, I've sort of got this, and I think I know where it's going to get him.
Yeah.
This could be tricky.
Yeah.
So, I mean, both of you really show how the forces of convention, or I suppose the forces of a particular environment, do either shape someone or fail to shape them. I mean, in the case of Agnes, I mean, you were talking about Agnes Douglas. I mean, she thinks of herself more along the lines of Elizabeth Taylor, or sort of models herself on that. And in the case of Mahmoud, I mean, he's sort of invisibilizing himself, but also not wanting to conform to any particular, as you say, any particular group. And there are so many groups in Cardiff at that time, as you evoke it, Nadifa. Yeah. So, I mean, who's to say what the main thing to be is?
Yeah, and even within Mungo, young Mungo Hamilton, the character at the heart of the book, is a young man who is discovering that he's queer, but he's growing up in this place where the masculinity around him is really narrow. You had to be hardworking, hard fighting, hard loving, hard drinking. You had to man up all the time and be incredibly brave. But it's the men around them that decide that is the system that they're in, but it's controlling them as well. Even the heterosexual men are very oppressed by it, and the way they're allowed to sort of express themselves is incredibly narrow. And then the women around them also keep asking the men to be brave and to be tough and to be violent and to be these things. And so it's a system that keeps feeding itself. It keeps asking for the worst from these men, and at the same time for them to be very silent and not have a full breadth of emotional response other than perhaps anger or strength. And Mungo's just so far on the outside of it, but he spends so much of his time in the book performing his masculinity, as I did as a young man, trying all these things just to be close enough to the other lads so that you weren't conspicuous, but far enough away because it just wasn't your true personality. And these systems can crop up, and they can be really self-policing and oppressive.
And I was thinking while you were speaking of what's the central identity that Mahmoud has. And I guess the one thing that he couldn't have argued with is he was an immigrant in post-war Britain. With everything else, he was Somali, but didn't want to be the same as the other Somalis that were in Cardiff at the time. He was Muslim, but not really practicing by this stage in many ways. He was black, but what did that mean? It's such a vague. It's not a. How do you be black? How do you live a black life? It doesn't really add up to much at that time. But he was an immigrant, and he didn't want to accept the limitations of what being an immigrant, the limits imposed on immigrants were the things that he was wrestling with, and being confrontational. Being someone who didn't just accept the lowly paid jobs that were offered to him, who married a Welsh woman and had kids with her, and didn't accept when she wanted to separate from him. All of these things made him in confrontation with the world. And maybe that's essentially who he was. He was someone that he was never going to accept the world as it was. And his wife was like that as well. Laura was the same, and they found each other in Cardiff.
Yeah, which is the story of an individual as opposed to a society. It's an individual who's sort of,
Yes.
beating up the society, rubbing
You'll
up
find them
against
everywhere.
it and wanting to hit it. Yeah. Nadifa, I'm not sure which passage you're going to read, but Douglas, I think your passage on page 320 might lead us somewhere into the masculinity question and more. Do you want to go first, or Nadifa, do you have a view?
You go first.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, this is a passage towards the end of the book. Mungo has been called up to fight. His older brother is the leader of the local gang, but he's the leader of the local Protestant gang, and Mungo's his beloved, is a Catholic man. And so Mungo is going to fight with these boys, and only to protect his reputation and to protect his beloved James. But this is where he goes to join the boys. It's a short passage. Mungo came out of the close and joined a pack of proddy boys heading to the waste ground. He fell into formation amongst the baby-faced warriors. He swung his meatless legs in imitation of their gallus way of walking, his shoulders about his ears, and a sour scowl on his face. This swagger was a uniform as ubiquitous as any football top. It had a gangly forward motion like a big, bald, bandy-legged weasel, head swung low, eyes always fixed on the prey ahead, ready to lunge with either a fist or a silver blade. Mungo tried his best to wear the uniform, but he felt like an imposter. It was a poor imitation. The smur wetted them to the skin. The fine mist found its way into the cracks of clothing and pushed through their shoes, making their white socks damp and grimy. It ate them from the feet up, inching inside their denims and soaking them through to their underwear. The spitting rain was only visible when they stepped into the pools made by the orange street lamps. These orange lights gave a feeling of warmth that had been missing in the grey daylight hours. Now and again, the boys stopped and huddled underneath them. They passed half bricks and homemade shanks between themselves as if they were swapping toys. Thank you.
I'll read a small scene from when Mahmoud is looking for work while he's still free. Mahmoud shoves his hands into his sports jacket and paces from one notice to another, looking for boiler or foundry work. He has only shrapnel in his pocket, having lost the rest at poker. There is nothing worth trying for. None of the usual firms that can be relied upon to take coloured fellas are advertising. He looks again at the grave digging notice. It's for Western Cemetery. The pay not half bad, but the thought of shoveling hard, damp earth and filling it with stiff corpses makes him shake his head and mutter, Astaghfirullah. Pulling his Homburg hat low over his eyebrows, he takes a yellow ticket stamped with a 9 and waits for his turn for the counter beside one of the heavy coiled radiators. The heat from the cast iron blasts through his thin trousers and teases his skin somewhere between pleasure and pain, and he rocks his body back and forth, letting the heat rise and dissipate. On the last tramper he had taken, the owners had installed new boilers, and all the brass fittings had shone gold in the white light of the furnaces. He had stepped back to admire the conflagration before shoveling more coal in and turning the white light into an almost sentient, colourless gas that roved backwards and up the chimney like a djinn escaping a lamp. He had birthed that fire and nurtured it, from yellow to orange to white to blue, and then that colour that had no name, just pure energy. He'd wondered what it would be like to step forward the few inches that separated him from it, whether like an adabka, his skin would just fall from his flesh like a sheet. He had been formed by those fires, turned from a puny pantry boy into a knotted, muscled stoker who could stand at Hell's Gate for hours at a stretch, his face roasted and grimy with coal dust.
Thank you. God, so much to talk about in both of those. But actually, just starting from the end, I thought we might, it'd be good to hear from you a little bit about the world of work I mean, work doesn't appear too much actually in sort of, I suppose, classical 20th century fiction, let's say. And in this case, I mean, there's lots of non-work, but there's also a kind of, a generalized working class, and the sense that the work that there is, you both describe with sort of beautiful detail in its ordinariness, I mean, what was that like to try and engage with the world of work in fiction?
Well, I'm someone who has avoided the world of work as much as possible, but I've done lots of different jobs. And one link between Douglas and I is that we both worked for The Gap in different roles. But for me, I think that identity of the job that you do, you are a sailor, you not just a sailor, but you are a stoker. I think that was a key element of how people, especially men, identified themselves. That's where your dignity came from, even your physicality. Mahmoud's body was forever changed by his work in engine rooms. It was so difficult. It was a test of masculinity. But also it was a racialized job where it was so unpleasant, but many British sailors did not want to do it. So they employed Somalis, Yemenis, Bengalis, people from the colonies who would do it, and would do it for less pay than the British sailors. So all of those tensions of the world of work, these men, this multicultural district of Cardiff, Tiger Bay, only existed because of the economic relationships built between between Britain and its empire. And they were not meant to come back to Britain. They were always meant to be cheap labor in these colonies. And suddenly these young men started arriving and marrying local girls and creating this cosmopolitan mixed community. And that was a terror. And the fact that they also had power, economic power, was a terror, and could go on strike and could disrupt the shipping industry, which Britain relied upon, was also, I think, part of the dynamic behind Mahmoud's fate.
Yeah, it's, a lot of my work deals with the fact that here's a proud working class city that was experiencing 26% unemployment under the Thatcher government, when so much of the rest of the UK was prospering under privatisation. It was booming in the capital city in the south. And so many of the men and the women in my books don't know who they are. They don't know how to get on to tomorrow, because it's really crippling the community. And when I started to write Shuggie Bain, I was thinking about my personal pain, because growing up amongst that, there was so much trauma there for me, round about my masculinity, round about how much money we didn't have at home. But it was only when I really started to develop a place of sympathy for the men did I start to have a fuller picture of what might have happened, and did I feel some catharsis for myself. I had to really reckon with how damn hard it was to go down into a coal mine every single day, and to lie on your belly and to hack at a coal face and not know if you're going to come up again to the light or be killed, or there was so many gassy seams and the collapses that were happening. My family were in shipbuilding, so to go up in an 80-foot staging in all kinds of weathers and not even get a tea break. A lot of the union disputes were about the men wanted a tea break, the government or the owner wouldn't give it to them, wouldn't give them 15 minutes. And I had to reckon, a lot of my work is reckoning with the emotional state that these men bring back to their lives. And, we couldn't ever ask them if they were vulnerable, if they were scared, if they had other ambitions. Because if you'd asked a man that, how could he then the next day go back into the earth and do that again? So you had to let them sit with their silence in many ways. And silence brings a lot of badness out. There's a lot of violence and a lot of fury that can live there, but then also feelings of not being worth very much. And I had to really reckon with that when I was thinking about how young gay boys felt. First of all, how did the heterosexual men that were not feeling, like they were worth much? And then, by the way, the government comes along and says, you're no longer required. You're standing in the way of progress for this country after hundreds of years and generations of doing this same job. And when I started to understand that pain, I started to understand pain everywhere in a way.
Yes, and you just made me realize, actually, that both Cardiff and Glasgow were shipping cities.
That's right.
And based on the coal industry as well. Mm-hmm. And a constant conflict between men in Cardiff was labour. Yeah. Who would get which jobs and under which conditions. Mm-hmm. And in the end, both of them were flung to the side. In the 80s, the whole industry collapsed, and it didn't matter whether you were black or white or wherever you were from. you were disposed of.
Yeah, and it's actually so funny you were talking about the immigration coming to do the jobs that people didn't want, because in my community they couldn't get jobs, and so they were forced to migrate elsewhere. And so many of my family, my community, were lost to South Africa or to Canada or to anywhere that they could find a job, and it tore families apart. Mothers lost their sons, and and we lost siblings to it, and it was such a strange thing, and actually a sign of like a lack of health in the government and in the economy, and people are still reeling from it. Yeah.
No, that's it's interesting. You come back to the 1980s, even though the books aren't both set there. Oh, not yeah. I mean, it's interesting, Douglas, that you were saying that, because I want to come back to this question if you're writing historical fiction, both of you. Let's call it that for the moment. But I also want to ask you about the cities themselves. I mean, you've touched on that, and Douglas, you said, well, that you didn't get to see the other side of Glasgow, or you only get to see this tiny bit. On the other hand, you evoke a portion of Glasgow that does seem to stand, if not for the whole, because it can't be the whole, but the whole of a certain aspect of it. And even just in that passage that you read with the orange lights and that there's a very there's a very evocative sense of place there in both books, I think. And so, and Nadifa, in your case, I mean, there's an incredible sense of the sort of multiplicity of the texture of Cardiff or of Tiger Bay at that time. And I mean, passages where you understand that there's a Norwegian church, that there's a kosher abattoir in the same passage, but also there's the Jewish shopkeeper, there are the Chinese laundry people, there are I mean, so many different communities there. And Mahmoud is talking about the Yemenis, and even at a sort of very difficult moment. I mean, again, I hope we'll come back to this when we start talking about language, but when he's stuck in the police station and finds himself sort of tripping up over his words and speaking all sorts of bits of many different languages. So in one case, the sort of multicultural city of Cardiff in the 1950s, so we're talking about 1952 here, and in the other case, this city of Glasgow, working class Glasgow, that is poor but also sectarian, which I think Young Mungo comes back to much more clearly, but I think the seeds of that are sown in Shuggie also. So, I mean, how did you relate to your respective cities in order to portray them in your fiction?
I think I kind of fell in love with Cardiff. I didn't grow up there. People, I think, have got confused and think I'm actually from Cardiff. I'm not. And I just started visiting the city to learn more about, it's got a long history for Somalis as sailors. And my father had entered Britain through Wales, Port Talbot, and then settled in Hull. And then I grew up in London. But Cardiff was the piece of the puzzle that I wanted to get to know more. So I went there with my father years ago when I was researching my first novel, Black Mamba Boy. But it's a small city with some of the elements that you're talking about of it being a working class city. It's very young. It was established late 19th century as the price of coal, the value of coal shot up, and all of these mines were exporting to the rest of the world. But its existence as a multi-racial cosmopolitan city was under threat from the beginning. And I think the chief of police in the 1920s was desperate for mixed-race marriages to be made illegal, because he saw all of these young Black men looking amazing in their cricket whites and in their suits, and the way that they dressed as peacocks. They were workers, but they dressed in a way that really undermined feelings of British superiority. Was a threat. And it was, Tiger Bay was where the captains of industry lived, and they had all of these grand houses and villas. They moved out, and then it slowly became a poorer and poorer district and was literally sinking. It was built on marshes and was just sinking. And in the 1960s, after a long fight, the council demolished the neighborhood. So now I can't go there and see where the shop was or where Mahmoud lived in this lodging house. It was all demolished, but the community remained. So the community was decanted into new builds, 2 massive tower blocks in the center of Tiger Bay, and then low-rise masonettes all around. So the children, the grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the characters are still there, and that's the community that I was trying to tap into. And I honestly wouldn't have been able to write this book if I hadn't met those people and heard their stories and felt their own resentment about how Tiger Bay had been treated all over, through the years.
Yeah, I can't wait to go to Cardiff. Actually, you've made me want to go. I've never been to Wales, but I am a Scotsman. I'm a proud Scotsman, and I've always loved Glasgow. But Glasgow didn't always love me when I was a young man. It had a really tough time with young queer boys in poverty in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But I'm a Glaswegian who has spent 20 years living in America, and I make no sense other than in Glasgow. Some of you are probably wondering what my accent is now and looking at me, but Glasgow's home, and my family are still on the streets that I write about, and it had such a profound shaping experience on me as a child that even when I write stories about New York, I'm still writing about it with a Glaswegian's point of view. I cannot ever shake it. It's such a strong city. But it is a city that has a lot of compassion, a lot of warmth, a lot of humanity. It's very direct. It doesn't ever like false flattery. And it wants you to tell it very honestly. But it can be a city of enormous sadness and an enormous joy and humor. It can be very tender. It can at times be violent. It's a fully functioning, diverse city. And is actually very historical. I mean, it's been there since the 600s. In the valley, and actually founded by Saint Mungo, which the character in the book is named after. But it's a city that went through an enormous amount of hardships in the last half of the 20th century. Unemployment went so high. And also it was mostly redesigned because it was so cramped and so crowded that it was treated as almost experimental, where a lot of the city was torn down and then brand new housing schemes were built. But people went from living in communities to living in what essentially became storage boxes or file cabinets, whether that was high-rise towers, whether that was schemes or estates that didn't have any amenities like a swimming pool or a library or shops. It was just this sort of failing of brutalist housing development. And the city today is so rejuvenated. It's torn a lot of that down. It has a brand new coat of paint. It was just voted the 8th best place in the world to be gay, to live. So there's hope. And Gaby did me a dirty when she said my book was historical fiction. It was set in my lifetime. It makes me feel very old, Gaby. You make me feel ancient. But I'm kidding. But so there's always hope for change. There's always hope for communities to become more diverse. And Glasgow's a wonderful place. Please do visit. You will be welcomed with open arms.
I want to visit because something amazing keeps happening where Britain is becoming more and more hardline towards refugees. Mm-hmm. And whenever they try and capture people, it does feel like they catch people and try and put them in these vans to deport them. The neighbourhoods in Glasgow just come out.
That's right.
And put themselves between the police and the refugee, and the refugee is never taken.
That's right.
They know how to fight.
That's right. We have a term. If you're from Glasgow, you're called a Glaswegian or you're called a Ouija. But anybody who's come and has been a refugee is now known as a refuweegee. And we've named them. You are part of it. But they did that remarkable thing. One of the strange things about that, Nadifa, is there was 2 refugees that were going to be, deported from the country, and the local community came out and crowded them as the police vans couldn't get into the street. They couldn't leave. It was a really proud moment. But it was the building that Shuggie Bain's bedsit is set in, really? Which wasn't meant to be. And so it was a very personal moment for me because I actually set the bedsit in that on that street. Yeah.
And it happened again last week.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very proud of Scotland.
Yeah.
Well, so just to apologise, Douglas, I mean, I did.
You don't have to apologise.
So my point about historical fiction was more that obviously it's within living memory. I mean, yeah, but very much so for me. But I suppose my point is that the context, the tide of history is somehow having an effect on these characters, right?
Yeah.
So. And both of you are very good at conveying that, at conveying the sort of the close-up view of the character. You as a reader get to know them, but somewhere in the background you feel that Thatcher exists, or somewhere in the back. Well, not even in the background in your case, Nadifa, because your book opens with Queen Elizabeth becoming queen, on the death of her father, and I think that you set in train a series of thoughts about empire, or the remnants of empire, or the effects of empire, along with that. So. You already get a hint of that to come. And in your case, Douglas, I think that, I mentioned the sectarian aspect, but you are showing your readers, many of whom will be completely unfamiliar with that. I mean, I know lots of people who read Shuggie and said, I had no idea that this Catholic Protestant thing was such a big deal. And little did they know that was where you were going to go next in this love story. And I think that by making it a love story, in this case, you do show both. You show how important it is to the characters, but you also show the background. And I suppose I wanted to ask you both how you navigated that, because you have to, I mean, it is historical fiction in a way, because you have to give your readers a sense of history, but it may even be harder than writing about, say, the Tudors, because you have to figure out how much will your readers already know, how much context do you give them, and how can you show the impact of history on the individual, I suppose, which both of you do incredibly well. So I just wondered how you thought that through.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to write about sectarianism is because I felt it's entirely overlooked, and it was something that we kept very secret or very close within the community. But so in a way, it's hidden Britain. But I think we're really in an era where writings are dealing with the empire, we're dealing with divisions and all its kind of levels, and people who feel very overlooked. And sectarianism for me was a very strange frequency of my childhood. I'm the son of a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, and it even began at our dinner table, where we thought it was banter. We would say essentially shitty things to each other, or my dad would say it about my grandmother, and we would think, that's funny, that's banter. But in 2022, it's hate speech, and it would definitely be that. And so context even changes its meaning. But I was a young man that, there is so much cross cultural immigration and trouble and just communities moving since the Reformation on, and since Northern Ireland and Scotland are such close countries together, that we couldn't help but feel an enormous amount of sympathy for the troubles that were happening in Northern Ireland. But sectarianism for us was legitimized through sports teams. If you were a Catholic, you supported Celtic. If you were a Protestant, you supported Rangers. We were divided into schools at the age of 4. And you could be a street away from a Catholic family, or, we lived in the same communities. But it was a way to make tribes out of young working class men. And sometimes the working class men ran with it. And now the violence in the book, Mungo turns to his older brother James and says, Hamish, why are we doing this? Why are we fighting the Catholics? And he says, well, it's a little bit about recreation. It's a little bit about reputation. It's a little bit about respect. But it's also just something to do. It's fucking fun. And a lot of the gang fights and a lot of the things I got involved in as a young man was because there was nothing else to do. And we used to love throwing bricks at Catholics, and they used to love throwing bottles at us. And then, you might end up dating one of their sisters. It was all very interweave, and it made no sense at all. But it was just part of the community. And as we're reckoning with some really big divisions in the world, I couldn't get over it, especially now as an American. I couldn't get over how weird it was. Because it was never actually about identity like it is in Northern Ireland. If you'd have cut any Glaswegian Catholic or Glaswegian Protestant down the middle, they'd have been like, I'm Scottish. We are the same. And so in a way, it was something to do. It was a way to identify yourself.
Yeah. Nadifa, do you want to say about history?
About sectarianism?
You can if you like, yeah.
I don't know enough.
Yeah.
No, about history, the effect of history, and how you sort of try and weave history, the bigger picture, into the close-up. I guess.
So I studied history and politics at university. So I think that's my first love, is trying to work out why things have worked out the way that they are. Why did Somalia have a civil war in the 1980s? Why did my father come to Britain in the 1940s? All of these, I guess, are quite personal questions, and fiction allows you to learn. There's so much, I went to university and none of these, we didn't approach any of these questions at all. We stayed in the Tudors, in the Renaissance, and various other periods of time, which now feels like a very active choice. It feels like a political choice for us to not think about these things. Why did I not know the impact of being Catholic in Scotland or in Northern Ireland in a real way? So I've had to teach myself through these novels what's happened in the world. And Mahmoud's life, for example, is a microcosm of so much, where he's got a very complicated relationship to empire. I wouldn't say that he was someone that rejected it completely. He was not an activist. He was not like the others, other colonial workers or men from the colonies who had joined independence movements or were communists or Marxists. He was not that. He was a quite naughty man who was very obsessed with his Welsh wife and wanted to look good and have some money in his pocket. He wasn't a political figure, but the choices that he was making, when he tells the police, you're liars, you're all liars. and you just want to pin this on a black man. This is what you always do. That in its way is political. And someone like him who ended up sacrificing his life for the sake of his dignity, for his pride, they did pave a way for someone like me to be able to criticize the police nowadays. You know, I can criticize the police without much fear in the UK. So there's a connection there between how he lived and how I live. And even making that connection makes me feel like I owe him something. You know, you've gone before me, and I need to, if all I can do is learn about you, fine. If I can do more with your story, even better.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, I think it's interesting that you're talking about a real life case, a real life character, because you've written a novel around him and about him and imagined so much. And when you talk about what you studied at university, it makes me think, well, maybe that's what novels can do more than history books. I mean, even if you're dealing with historical material, what is the form that shows you what it feels like to be living in that time, or what it feels like to have history act upon you? I mean, maybe only a novel can do that. Do you think?
I think I love that there are some amazing historical non-fiction works out there that do make you feel what someone would have felt in Stalingrad or in Berlin or in Tudor England, whatever it might be. And the techniques and the things that you use to make those experiences feel true and feel tangible are not so different between fiction and non-fiction, I think. But the reason I write it as fiction is for the freedom it allows. So I'm not bound completely into one historical moment. I can think about the generation before, and not feel obliged to have all of these footnotes underneath justifying every comment and every description. So for me, it's a creative decision to allow myself that freedom. But I think I read a lot of nonfiction now, which to me feels as emotive, as powerful as fiction.
Yeah, no, that's good. Much fairer than my question suggested. It's all right. You're allowed to write non-fiction people. Douglas, what about you? I mean, I suppose you had the choice too. I mean, you could have written anything when you started.
Why not memoir for you?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. In fact, when I began writing the book, I thought I was going to write it from Shuggie Bain's point of view, just from this one 8-year-old boy. And I realized really quickly that an 8-year-old boy just couldn't process all the different things that were happening, whether that be the labor movement, addiction, sexuality, misogyny, divisions in religion, housing problems. He just couldn't get through it all. And so the chorus rushed in. And the problem was when the chorus rushed in, the first draft of the novel was 1,800 pages. And so they were like, this is a social moment, hold on. And they all pulled up a chair and they all told me something about the world. And I was grateful for it ultimately, because if you pin all of that on an 8-year-old boy, then you feel like as an author, you're pinning it on yourself. And you're saying, this was my experience here. And using the chorus allowed me to be braver and to not pull my punches as much. And also to set up the characters almost like camera lenses, where they could all look at the same thing, but then give you, a reader, a truer picture of it, because it wasn't just one reporter's eye point of view. And I found that I could hide there, and that I learned things about the experience too. You know, when we spoke about sectarianism, I could tell you exactly how it tasted, how it felt, how we carried ourselves within it, and I had no idea why we were doing it. I had no idea until I really sat down and I looked at Irish immigration and British imperialism, and even how we ghettoized the Irish when they came to Glasgow. We set them up in different neighborhoods. And so, as you say, sort of interrogating the past in that way through fiction allows you to deepen your own understanding.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, can we talk a bit about language? Because in both of your books, you introduce words that are, I mean, I'm interested in your confidence to introduce words that may not be familiar to all readers. And so how that makes you think about your readers, I suppose, the confidence to think that your readers that you will develop or adopt the readers who are suited to these books. I mean, Douglas, just in that passage that you read, two of my favorites I've got in my very dog-eared copy of Shuggie Bain. I've got a list of words. Yeah. I might just glance at this for you. So in that passage you read, you had gallus and smur. I love smur. I love smur too. Yeah. Can you tell everyone what those words mean briefly?
Yeah.
There is a brief version.
Yeah, well, smur is a directionless mist in a rain. It's sort of that thing that gets you very, very wet, but you can't quite see where it's coming from. And then gallus is a sense of supreme self-confidence. Someone can be gallus, or a pair of boots can be gallus, but it's a really, it's a word with a lot of energy. But when I was writing the book, I was aware of our tradition in the United Kingdom of using received pronunciation or using Oxford English. And I was aware also of James Kelman's Booker win when it was so controversial in 1992 when a judge stormed out because here is a book that won, that was written in dialect, written with Glaswegian and Scots words. And I had to make a decision when I was writing Shuggie Bain, whose side am I on? You know, who am I writing this for? Shuggie and Agnes are characters that don't find themselves in literature hardly ever. And if I'd suddenly have written something that was written in Oxford English, I would have been looking at them with you and not standing beside them. And I care very deeply about these characters, and I didn't want to turn their lives into fiction and then exclude them from that experience. And so I rejoiced in the language, and even though it gave the book a really difficult time when it came to publication, it was rejected a lot, and I think it was rejected because people thought language would be a barrier. I knew that readers were curious. I know that I read to discover new worlds, to discover new language. And once you can hear the sort of the rhythm of a song, or you then start to know how the book will come together. You can hear them talking. But it was so funny, Gaby. I was in Bath last week, and there was a woman in the front row, and she was so excited. She was an American woman, so sorry about it. You have to own this lady. She's one of yours. But she was so excited, and she was squirming, and it came to questions, and her hand shot up, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great because she's been wriggling for an hour.
It's always a bad sign.
So I know, but I took it the wrong way. I was like, it's going to be great. She's so keen. And she went, congratulations on your book being translated into nearly 40 languages. But my question is, when will it be translated into English?
That's fighting talk.
Thank you. That was fighting talk. So I had great pleasure telling the First Minister of Scotland that a couple of nights later, and I've been dining out on this story for months now. So, but you know, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She didn't get the laugh she thought she was going to get. Yeah.
I was also really interested in writing in a new way about language itself. Mahmoud was a multilingual man. He spoke 5 languages, and as well as those languages, he also had to learn an English, which was the English of working class Cardiff, with its shrapnel, you know, changes shrapnel in your pocket. It's got a bit of Welsh in there. It's everything. It's the language that he picks up in films. So when he's in prison, in the transcripts, when they're not happy with him, he's swearing in a very American style, which I guess he picked up from the films he'd seen. So I love that. I think that was a big part of what attracted me to him and to that world, was the fact that linguistically it was interesting. He can, or in the novel, that people are speaking Hindi and Yiddish and Arabic and Somali, and it's all there. And it's a big part of the way the police saw him. You know, I think in Britain it's still true that if you have a foreign accent, you're treated in a way that, as if you're not quite mature or understanding in the way that someone with an English accent or a British accent would be. And that plays against him in those interviews where he starts to muddle English words and the grammar up. And it's partly because he knows 5 languages and he's trying to navigate between them all. But it worked against him. But for a writer, being able to play with all of these languages, that's what it felt like. It was a way for me to learn these terms and to play and to think about how language represents someone's personality and their world and their part to play. So he's not just in Cardiff, he's someone who's part of the working class of Cardiff. And when the barristers and the lawyers are talking in this Oxbridge English, he doesn't understand what they're saying, but so would it be the same case for a Welsh white person from the same economic background. There are divisions amongst divisions amongst divisions.
Yeah, it's beautiful how you meld all of those together, and we have such a prejudice against accents in the United Kingdom. We're slowly sort of, the younger generation is moving beyond that, where they're really embracing with pride their regional accent. But I grew up in a time where it was to be suppressed. If you were going to be anything in the world, you had to talk like a BBC newscaster. And Agnes falls for this. Agnes Bain in the book, she's identical to the women that live on either side of her, both socioeconomically and in terms of her education and attainment. Council houses are all identical. And yet she talks in this way that is artificial in a way to her. And it becomes this conversation about pride and shame, but it's all the information she's received from the empire, that if you're going somewhere, don't have a broad Glaswegian accent, talk in this sort of newscaster's voice. And the tragedy for Agnes and for Shuggie is that it backfires on them. It increases their isolation rather than allows them to be part of the beautiful community that they're in.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's still a very current issue. And there's regular discussions about whether schools should intervene in making working class children from various backgrounds, or particularly from Black and Asian backgrounds, speak in proper English, whatever that is.
Proper.
And part of me thinks, well, if you go into law, if you go into business, everyone does have the same accent. So maybe for your own chances, you should change your natural accent and code switch and all of the rest of it. And of course, it's a conversation people have in the US to a degree. But why should you? If you have the same qualifications, why should you?
Yeah,
when do you push back?
Yeah, it's one of the beauty of Britishness as well, though, that we have so many diverse accents, and it's part of one of the things I think we should celebrate. But it tends to lead people from a regional place to code switching their entire life.
Yeah, which is another form of hiding.
It's another form of hiding. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and all of those multiple selves and the anxiety within it, I think, is what you really get, the sense of what you get as a reader from both of you. It just sort of reminded me that you shouldn't just be able to imagine the world; you should be able to hear it as well. And you can really hear all of that as you're reading. So, yeah, it's brilliant and impressive, and I think it is also kind of progress for. Well, this sounds incredibly pretentious. I was going to say progress for fiction, but there was a many years ago I interviewed Toni Morrison, and she actually was talking about being an editor at Random House. So this was before she wrote most of her novels, and she was really proud of that, because the thing she was so proud of was feeling that she was in a position to make sure that if there were Black authors, and she did edit many people, that they wouldn't be sort of have their voices edited white. So that she could bring these voices out in a way that other people that actually wouldn't be done otherwise. I mean, that's just one example, but this sense of sort of caring for the way things can appear on a page, I really feel that it's important, and both of you render it in very different ways, but in a way that seems like, okay, yes, of course readers will be able to just absorb this and understand what it means and hear it. So
yes, and it makes me think there was a part of your question that we didn't answer, which was how we perceived our audience, our readers, and what we were willing them to what we wanted them to feel, I guess, when they're reading our work. And I'm quite happy with readers, and myself as a reader, feeling that I'm other, that I'm othered by the novel. I don't have to understand everything. And that experience of not knowing certain aspects of the culture, the language, the mores about the way that these people behave, that's an important part of you understanding their experience, rather than constantly explaining, constantly spoon-feeding with a glossary and, this is how people eat this in this country. It does a disservice, because it takes you out of the story, and it also doesn't allow you to feel what it feels to be not seen, not included, ignored.
Yeah, beautifully put. I mean, simply for me, I just want the reader to leave their world and come into mine. And if you're coming, you're going to immerse fully. And that's it.
Yeah, no, and it also suggests that having a glossary would suggest you already knew who the readers were and that they were a certain way and they were not these people, whereas actually that it might be, they might be anyone. So now I've left very little time for questions, I'm afraid, but I'm sure there are some. And there is a Mark is there with a microphone. If those of you who are present would like to ask a question, please do. And if you wouldn't, we can carry on.
You've already heard the worst question I've ever been asked. So you can't, honestly, it's the only way is up.
And now you don't have to ask that one.
I know. That's why I always tell it, because then I don't get it again. I don't get it.
The worst one that Val McDermott, well, you must know Val McDermott, who's a Scottish crime writer. She came back from a festival once and said, the worst question, it was, if you were a biscuit, what kind of biscuit would you be?
Wow. Okay, Douglas.
Oh, what kind of biscuit? I don't even know. Something very plain. Something salty as well.
I'd be a gooey cookie.
Oh.
See, it's a good question.
It's a good question, yeah.
After all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should we, if you would like to walk up to the mic, please do. Well, I'm just going to ask maybe one last question while we wait, if that's a good idea. About your influences, I suppose. I mean, I was wondering whether there were other authors who had paved the way for what you wanted to do, and if so, who they were.
I can go first. I always answer with the same person first, and it's Claude Mackay, who was a Jamaican writer living in New York in the Harlem Renaissance, and he wrote Home to Harlem, which was the first best-selling novel by a black writer, and it's published 1928. And he was a stoker, as well as worked on the railroads. So he was part of the proletariat that he was writing about, but also this modernist writer, poet, bohemian, radical, who was encouraged to write Home to Harlem by Trotsky because he was in Moscow during one of the big conferences in the late 20s. So I love his mixture of a lived life, a really interesting lived life, an activist life with a playful and intelligent take on the people that he's writing about. It wasn't just, let me tell you about the terrible social conditions. Trotsky told him to write about the socioeconomic conditions of African Americans to try and persuade them to turn to communism. And he sort of did that, but not really. And instead, it's about the queer world of Harlem in the 1920s. People such as W.E.B. Du Bois hated the novel. He said it made him want to take a bath because it was not celebrating the best of the community and wallowing in the filth. But why is it filth? What makes the people who have come north and are working and hustling and sleeping in overcrowded tenements, why are they to be hidden? And Claude Mackay was not interested in hiding them.
I cannot wait to read that. I've not read that yet. Yeah, I didn't read books really till I was about 17 or 18. And what happened was we just didn't have books in the community. It wasn't something we turned to. But when I was 16, my mother died. And when I was 16 as well, my school emptied out. Because when you became 16 in the area I grew up in, it was quite deprived. Kids would just go to find work. They couldn't give any more of their life to education. They had to make a living. And so of the 250 kids at my school, only 12 of us came back post 16. And so what happened was, in my year, I mean, and so what happened was I was often in classes by myself or with just another kid. And we had these fantastic English teachers, Mr. Archibald and Mr. Arthur, and they just start to feed me, having not really read that much, just start to feed me books. And the first books that I read was the works of Thomas Hardy and, you know, Tess the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure. And there's some Tess in Agnes and there's some Jude in Leek. But, you know, they were such wonderful teachers that they really opened the world to me. But Tennessee Williams wasn't on the curriculum, and they just saw that I was a wee gay boy, I think. They could never say it. And so they started to just slide Tennessee Williams around the desk at me. And you've got like Amanda Wingfield, you know, and I'm like, oh, all the melodrama I'd been looking for. And I just loved it. But there's a little bit of Blanche and a little bit of Amanda and Agnes, and they've just been such formative things for me. But I think the biggest influence on me is that early 90s moment of Scottish literature, where you have these giants like Irvine Welsh and James Kelman and Alan Warner and Janice Galloway and Agnes Owens. And this was the first time that I saw not Scottish voices, but working class Scottish voices celebrated and powerful and full-throated. Yes. And that's been a huge thing for me.
And there's lots of cross-fertilization. So I love Irvine Welsh, and he said that he was highly influenced by Black American working class writing because there was nothing about his own experience that he could identify with in British literature, so he had to go abroad. Yeah. So I think we're constantly looking. I would read a lot of Indian fiction because there was nothing quite like Somalia in the writing that I was receiving at school or in the UK at the time. So I think that magpie approach is probably what makes up most writers.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Go ahead. Sorry. Yes. Thank you for asking a question. Thank you in advance for your question.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. I'm wondering, after you've completed your first draft, what do you look for in the subsequent drafts to help edit it down to what the books eventually become?
That's a good question.
Ooh.
That's a hard question.
Yeah. Well, for Shuggie Bain to go from 1,800 pages to 500, I looked for a really strong, smart husband because he was the one that read the manuscript first. And actually, he spent the first 200 pages paying such close, fine attention to my work, to the world, to the characters, to the metaphors. And then by about page 200, the will to live just left his body. And he started just to redact it. But the truth is, for me, I look for characters that feel complex and complicated and alive. And if they don't feel that way to me, I try to pull them out and their story out of the book. But I learned a lot through the Shuggie and the drafts about the lens and about other things can be happening in a world, but where do you want the lens, almost like you're a director, where do you want that to be in a story? And that's really what the 10 years I was honing in Shuggie Bain to get there. But I'm a huge rewriter. I mean, one of my favorite writers is Muriel Spark, but she writes one draft and then she edits it and she publishes it. And I just don't have that power. And so Shuggie, is constant rewriting for me. And it's feeling, I feel it, I feel my way through it.
So I went down from 600 pages to 300 for this novel, and that felt very painful. And what I took out was a lot of the things that interested me as someone who was obsessed with the history and the facts of this case. The transcript chapter, which is still in there, was 4 times the length, with every question included pretty much, because to me it's all exciting and interesting, but it's not for the reader.
Yeah.
So you do need to step back and keep asking yourself, what is the story? What is the story? What is the story? So that does help you refine, but I don't think you ever know. You never really know, okay, this is now finished. I've got to the draft that I'm happy with. But it's a slow, well, it's actually not very slow, it's actually often very fast because they're waiting for you to hand it in. So it's a gut response to what does have to remain and what can be taken out at a push.
Thank you. Go ahead. So thank you for the next question.
Hi, thank you for that conversation. It was so stimulating and enriching. I was so immersed. Thank you. Nadifa, you chose to write about a male character, and I feel like as a female author, I feel this pressure to always, or mainly, have female characters, my main characters. For some reason, I find myself having an easier time writing a male character.
Me too.
I was wondering if you face criticism for that and how you answer that. And Douglas, with the way you write, makes me feel like I'm not just reading a story, it makes me go right there in Glasgow and be with Mungo, be with Shuggie. And it's because of every detail that you include in every paragraph and in every scene. I was wondering if that's the way you perceive the world. Are you processing a lot every minute of your life? And how do you do that?
Thank you. Yes, I am.
No, luckily, no, I've not faced any criticism for writing from a male perspective. And I do find it easier, and I think maybe it's because we're surrounded by male perspectives in film, in literature, in life. So we imbibe it as women, whether we like it or not. And I find women much harder to write, and I'm not quite sure why. Yeah, how about you?
Yeah, I actually thought I was going to get more criticism for writing from a female perspective with Agnes and the women, and that was all I wanted to do because that was the heart, that was the pulse of that story, and it was the only reason I wanted to write it, to look at femininity, whether that's homosexuality or just women in a masculine world. But yeah, I think part of it is not reading. I was always just a very observant child, and I think a child of addiction has to be observant. And so the world for me, I've just from very early age, just really watchful, but watchful as a way of self-preservation and of coping. And that took me into a career in textiles and in fashion. And that's a world where you have to pay attention to the finest detail. Everything changes if you just shift the smallest thing. But I was also a little angry when I was writing Shuggie Bain because I received, a century's worth of information that says we don't like to look at working class lives in this huge amount of detail. Our classical novels all take place in, the world of Bronte or some stately home. And I thought these lives have as much dignity as any. They're deserving of the dignity of details. These are interesting, urgent lives. So you're going to know about the sofa. You're going to know about the gas meter. And I did it in a defiant way, but also because I realized many of my readers might never have been in poverty. They might never have seen that world. I'm very aware it's a middle class audience often, and so I thought, if you're coming, you're staying. You know, we're going together. If
And you're looking.
And you're looking. You are staying. Yeah. Thank you.
I love that, the dignity of detail.
Yeah.
Was there another question? I didn't know if someone was waiting to ask one, but if not, I think we'll wrap up because I've already run over time, although we did start a bit late, so that's okay. So just to remind you that Nadifa and Douglas will be signing books in the lobby, which I sadly can't join you in, so I will make myself another British cup of tea instead and think of you. But both of you, thank you so much for this incredible conversation.
Thank you, Gaby.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Gaby for doing this all the way from London with us. Yeah.
Always.